Okay, we'll get started with our third panel of the day, the construction of national citizenships, competing paradigms. We're pleased to have three distinguished panelists with us who will speak each for 15 to 20 minutes, and then we'll open things up to the broader audience for questions and comments. And throughout, please feel free to use the chat function to share more personal reflections about Rogers if you wish, and those can be shared with him at some point after the conference today. Our first speaker today will be MERAL UGUR CINAR, a Penn PhD graduate and former student of Rogers. She's currently assistant professor of political science at Bilkent University in Turkey, where she's joining us from today. She's the author of Collective Memory and National Membership, Identity and Citizenship Models in Turkey and Austria, a book which directly connects to the theme of our panel, along with numerous other works she's authored. Indeed, MERAL is the co-author, along with Rogers, of the piece Narrative Structures and the Politics of Peoplehood, which appears as a chapter in Rogers' 2015 book, Political Peoplehood. MERAL also has a new book forthcoming entitled Memory, Patriarchy, and Economy in Turkey, Narratives of Political Power. Thank you for being here, MERAL, and for being up at a relatively late hour, at least for academic events in Turkey. We really appreciate it. After that, we'll hear from Harris MYLONAS, who is Associate Professor of Political Science and International Affairs at George Washington University's Elliott School of International Affairs. Harris, like Rogers, has a deep interest in nationalism and the challenge of building national communities attentive to pluralism and diversity. He's the author of The Politics of Nation Building, Making Co-Nationals Refugees and Minorities, a book which was awarded the European Studies Book Award by the Council for European Studies. Among his copious research interests and output is a recent edited volume on fifth column politics, and also on an article on what seems to me a very interesting topic, pandemic nationalism. Finally, Sarah Song will be our third speaker. Sarah is the Milo Reese Robbins Chair in Legal Ethics Professor of Law at Berkeley, where she's also Professor of Philosophy and Political Science. Sarah is the author of Justice, Gender, and the Politics of Multiculturalism, which won the Ralph Bunchy Award from the American Political Science Association. She's also the author of the book Immigration and Democracy from 2018, along with numerous other pieces. Like many panelists today, Sarah was a student of Rogers, and I know she was also an invaluable research assistant to him as a graduate student when she helped him research what would become his 2003 book, Stories of Peoplehood. She gave a beautiful introduction to Rogers when he was APSA president in 2019 in Washington. And so we're very pleased to have her join us on the panel as well. Okay, so we'll start things off with you, MERAL. Look forward to it.
Thank you so much, Jeff. Thank you all who are here and who took part in organizing this. This is a celebration, of course, and I'm honored to be part of it. So as promised, I'm not going to talk about, I could tell so much, but I won't. For one reason, I might get very emotional, and the other one is I promised Rogers. So I go straight to the work. So this presentation is going to be, actually, it's also very useful for me because it helped me formulate, as Jeff said, I'm at the later stages of finishing my book, and it helped me once more to think about all this in depth, how we should approach the relationship between narratives and politics. And it is a continuation of my research for the dissertation, in which both Rogers, Jeff, and I, and they almost like they co-authored this with me. Their imprints, they will be my mentors forever, that's for sure. And I hope you can see the slides. I have some images for you also, so it should be useful to see them. Over the time, I kept thinking about what do narratives do? And this is a question that also came through reviewers as well. Okay, these are stories, but what do they do that's different than discourse or frames or other elements of politics? So how could we understand them? How could we make them useful? And I kept thinking about these ideas, political ideas. It has been now finally acknowledged that they're important. We have to take them seriously in our research, but ideas in our minds on their own, they don't seem to do much. They have to be carried through something. And I find that this is usually done through narratives, which provide this continuity between separate events. They help us make sense. They reduce the possible interpretations of events for us. And it really looks like they try to create a seamless relay almost among different eras in which past characters are replaced by new ones, as I will discuss in this presentation. So I'm not going to go further into detail because of time limits, but another thing that narratives do is the fact that they're employment rather than explanation, reason giving, is part of their strength. The emotional identification that they can create, and the way the listeners in a way co-constitute the narratives, and you can leave them vague, and they can actually fill in the gaps. This is very powerful, as we keep seeing. So let me make it this way. I think it's better. Okay. So even if it's a very personal story, if it's a very mundane story, as other scholars have also noted, we tend to think about them in broader communal stories, and they become very powerful in that regard as well. Cultural and global tropes are also carried through stories as sources of legitimization. But as I will discuss towards the end of this presentation, they can also become subversion, means for subversion of dominant political narratives, as opposed to just legitimizing tools. And also thinking about the criticism of studying culture in a static manner, in a timeless, like forever and like unchanging manner, I think narratives are very useful because they can tell us about the semiotic relationship that is created within a culture in terms of dominant stories, which subversive stories get into dialogue with dominant stories in a Bakhtinian fashion is very important in terms of understanding culture in a more dynamic sense. So let me briefly discuss our collaborations with Rogers. As Jeff mentioned, in those works, we merged together, we combined our typologies of content and structure, structures of narratives, and we had variation and similarities among US, Turkey, Austria, and Israel. And our central argument was political narratives institutionalized at the formative stages of countries have far-reaching effects that become especially visible during critical junctures of citizenship and national identity politics. This, I think, is a very important way of entering into comparative politics, also in terms of focusing on the critical junctures, the path-dependent nature of these stories, particularly at very important times of discussions about what it means to be part of a nation or what it means to be a minority within a nation. We discussed this issue of power asymmetry, and I think that's still something we deal with and we'll keep dealing with, because as Rogers also acknowledged in his other works, there is a power asymmetry that needs to be acknowledged. Not every story reaches the political realm, it doesn't get institutionalized, yet we also have to find ways of studying the narratives that are bottom-up, which is a point that I'll come to soon. More recently, which is also part of this book project, I got interested more into the narratives and populism. And in this presentation, which is part of that book, I focus on three types of narratives: historical, economic, and patriarchal narratives that are used by populist leaders in promoting their causes. So historical narratives, and for this presentation, I'll go over examples. This will be very illustrative and not very systematic because that would take time. But just a couple of examples in which populism and, for example, historical narratives operate from Turkey, Hungary, and Austria. The FPÖ, the far-right party, populist party, Strache, who was the previous leader. And then we have Orban in Hungary, and we have Erdogan and Turkey. So here, for example, we have a quote from Erdogan when he was criticized, apparently in a piece in the New York Times. And here he says, this is not new. They did the same thing to Abdülhamit, to Menderes, Özal, and to me. We know what source is behind this. They did the same during the Gezi incidents. Their purpose is to divide Turkey, to tear it apart, and to swallow it, but we will not allow it. Now, Abdülhamit was an Ottoman sultan, an autocrat sultan, but very much hailed by the political Islamists, and like juxtaposed towards the more secular challengers of his time. Menderes and Özal are leaders of the right populist leaders in Turkey, and Gezi, as you know, the latest protests. So he is putting himself in this lineage of these leaders, and whatever they were not able to achieve, he is going to be the sole leader who's actually going to be successful. And here you have Menderes. This is prepared by AKP, by the ruling party. Menderes was actually, this says you hanged him. He was executed by the 1960 coup. This is Özal, who died most probably of natural causes, but there's a conspiracy that he was poisoned. So this says you executed him, you poisoned him, but we will not let you have him. Like finally, he's going to fill this historical mission. That's one of the messages. Or here, for example, during the education system reform attempts. Again, I'm not going to go into the story in detail, but we see a juxtaposition of Haluk, who was actually a son of a secular intellectual who later became a priest, and Asım, a literary figure in a book, a poster child of for conservative Turk. So Erdogan revokes the story between them and uses it for his political goal. So in these historical narratives, he's the authentic representative of the people against those who are alien or hostile to the will of the people. And the story is bigger than his lifespan. It goes across time. Here we have in Hungary, for example, Orban on the anniversary of the 1948 revolutions. He talks about them, but he also talks about Trianon. He immediately brings the issue to the current immigration debates, external forces, international powers, but upcoming elections are also there. So everything, this is a historical struggle that he is now spearheading. Again, same with the 1956, 1990 commemorations. You have this language here. Perhaps neither the past nor the future of Hungarian nation matters to Brussels and international capital, but they matter to us, like this us versus them dichotomy, and him as the savior of the nation is very evident here. In Austria, you see that also the focus of the 1848 revolutions and a struggle for freedom. Interestingly, these days, fascism, far-right, comes with the language of freedom, ironically, and the party itself is also called that way. And the sieges of Vienna are quite critical here. And you see this is a pamphlet distributed during the Austrian mayoral elections. And this is the leftist mayor. These are lefties. They lie around. He's looking for pragmatic, opportunistic strategies to just live with the fact that the Turks are going to invade Austria. And here you have images of that. This is from the siege, and the vizier of the time says, okay, we weren't able to do it last time, but we'll surely do it next time. And this means the Turkish admission to the EU. So that's apparently how they're going to conquest Austria. And you have Strache here with a prominent war hero of the siege of Vienna in that book. Economic narratives, I'm just going to try to keep this short here. Erdogan is the leader tirelessly working for the economic well-being of its people, slowed down by the elites. And this is very problematic, of course, for democracy, because as you know, populism has a tendency to erode institutions. And whenever you put institutions in front of Erdogan as a limitation, higher courts, anything that wants to block his decision, he'll immediately come up and say they're slowing down our efforts to develop. So that developmental narrative, we have responsibility, they don't have, we have law, we're different, we work, we love this nation. So whenever, during corruption scandals, presidentialism debates, he would immediately bring in this narrative of a tirelessly working leader, constantly being slowed down and preventing people from economic success, which is actually ties into Rogers's the emphasis on economic stories. And here he also clearly gives the message that you won't be economically successful unless you support me, because these people don't want your interest. Only I want your interest. Orban, you have the same thing with IMF. And in the FPÖ case, it's more, since this is a more economically developed country, it's more about fairness. So this image depicts the ruling government carrying a message, pro-immigrant message on the T-shirt, and being carried by an actual cyclist of Austrian, like he works hard, but they're just slowing him down, and fairness is only going to come, again, you guessed it, with Strache. So the third type of narrative I want to talk about are patriarchal narratives. And here I want to stress that this just doesn't mean like male domination over women. In these stories, it is the protection aspect that makes these stories particularly patriarchal. Under Erdogan, the traditionally patriarchal messages are more clear. He talks about citizens as his children, daughters, sisters. So you have that familial relationship, and him as the protector of the, not the, like if it was nationalism, we could say nation, but of his people, because you can very easily become unworthy of protection if you behave as an undeserving citizen. He won't care, you will be out of the social contract in a way. So his people are the ones who are worthy of protection. So here he says, we have never left any victim in the hands of the perpetuator, and we will never do. So that is, again, a message that we receive from him. So here in Orban's case, we can see it's, again, Brussels, Berlin, Paris. We have prevented the Muslim world from inundating us from the south. Facing that direction, we are the last country in Latin or Western Christianity. We are standing firm. Our defense lines are sufficient to hold back. So that's a message that he keeps giving to the Hungarian. It's not only about physical protection of the Hungarian people, but also spiritual and cultural life, including family norms, etc. So he's going to protect them for his people. And here you have, again, from the FPÖ, we protect women. And this is what's going to happen to Austria if they fail to elect the FPÖ. So in a way, Strache is a mirror image to Erdogan, because for Erdogan, he's working tirelessly for the cause of the headscarf women, whereas Strache makes sure that Austrian women aren't put under burqas with the EU symbol here, obviously, flag. So they're saying different things, but if we think about it logically, I think they're mirror images of each other. So populism relies on stories that are told over and over. The historical narratives tell a story of a nation moving through history with a leader, furthering historical struggles. In the economic one, again, against all obstacles, we have the leader. And in the patriarchal one, they justify vertical decision-making despite comradeship with the people by assuming the role of the protector of the people. So this is next to my last slide, I think. So these are things I think, I'm glad, I would love to talk about. Also, I would further with Rogers later as a conversation. It's always so inspiring to do that. So telling stories that could counter populist leaders, I'll say, but Rogers will say maybe telling good populist stories. So that's a point where we diverge. Perhaps I had such a high dose of populism in this country that I became dismissive of it altogether. But that is something that's an ongoing conversation I'm looking forward to. Another question: are these stories the only way one could talk about gender development and the past? How can and do competing political blocs utilize such stories? And the last point, the dialogical nature of narratives that I mentioned at the beginning. I have devoted one chapter in the book on this, and I have focused on Gezi as a counter narrative. And what I mean by this, I'll try to illustrate with 3 images here. These are from the Gezi protests. Here you have, this is Boşol Tayyip Boşol, which means, so under religious marriage, Islamic religious marriage, which is not the official marriage, but the religious one, as you might know, under Islamic law, when you say 3 times talak, I divorce you, I divorce you, I divorce you, you'll get divorced. So they're using this against him as a way of divorcing their relationship from him, that power relationship that he's actually trying to build on them. And this says, would you like to have 3 children like us? And that is again a response to his patriarchal narrative, which keeps saying we should have at least 3 children. They are telling him in a way like, is this what you want? Like, and I have so many images of these in which they're in a very smart and courageous manner, using like entering into a dialogue, into his narrative. And that's the beauty of narratives. I think you can engage with them, but you can do so many things with them. It's very creative. This third one is very interesting. This is Bijiserok Atatürk. It is in Kurdish, and it says, long live leader Atatürk. And usually Kurds would use this to support either the leader of PKK, like Bijiserok Apo, or in other contexts. So using, and as for those of you who are familiar with Turkish nationalism, the homogenizing nationalism would never allow a Kurdish expression, even in this context, right? Like bringing these together, it is unthinkable in terms of the deep rooted cleavage that we are familiar with. I don't know who came up with this, and this is, by the way, as you might see, this pressure water that they somehow found when it was not functioning apparently, and they wrote it on it. So I have numerous examples and would be glad to elaborate on them, but I don't want to take further of your time. Thank you so much for everything. Thank you, Rogers, for being Rogers, and we have learned so much from you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, MERAL. Okay, Harris.
I'm not clapping at myself, but hello, everybody. Thank you for this presentation, MERAL. So my talk is called The Roger Smith Effect. So he asked me, as he did with everybody else, I think he asked me not to talk about him, but I've only broken the promise here and there. So basically, it's going to be the Roger Smith effect. So Rogers is a quintessential, I think, empirical political theorist, which is a category that we don't use often, but I think he is, in the sense that he is engaged both with how things ought to be and how they are. Rogers is focused on the politics of people making, and the term especially of ethical constitutive stories, or constitutive stories, as it has penetrated the literature more often with that term, brought me to what I would call his sphere of influence, not making any allusions to geopolitical issues of the day. In this sense, I could say I was also his student, although I wasn't formally one. With these terms, I think he allowed scholars, especially in my field, to talk about what I consider perennial questions, and he considers perennial questions about belonging and social order in ways that were not constrained by the existing paradigms of his time, but also today. Of his time, I mean, when he wrote this, not that he's not of our time, and did not privilege one paradigm over another. So I think it was a truly brilliant move, but more importantly, it was a very liberating move, at least for those of us who followed his lead. Rogers has contributed also in adding the US story, or the US case, if you want to put it that way, as a legitimate case next to other traditional cases we studied in nationalism studies. I don't need to remind those of you who have been studying nationalism for a long time that the United States was not often was excluded from the study of nationalism, because clearly the United States had nothing to do with national narratives and all these things. And prominent figures have said and written so in the past. So I think with Rogers' work, that was put to rest for good. Rogers has also challenged the civic ethnic divide in the literature, but not in a dogmatic way. And I'll come back to that in the way he has influenced at least my work. Finally, as introductory remarks, I would add that Rogers has provided key insights for our understanding of how circles of belonging come about, how they operate, and how they change. And all three of these questions are important, but Rogers is an empirical political theorist because he also has tried to tackle, as he would say, because he's modest, the question of how they ought to operate also, which is something that I cannot claim that I've done as much as he has. So let me give you an example from my work on nation building that I think demonstrates the importance of how his work has inspired other works. After having read Rogers' work and his brilliant move to use this term, constitutive stories and stories of peoplehood, I was inspired, and I would say even empowered, if I can put it that way, to come up with my own distinction and my own definitions of core and non-core groups as a way to understand, to kind of, as an attempt to go beyond the existing terms, especially terms like national minorities or minorities in general, terms like kin groups that were very popular in the 1990s, kin state and kin groups, a lot of terms that were perfectly appropriate for where they were used, but I think we're kind of limiting our imagination and applicability of some of these terms in a similar way that I think Rogers, without having talked about this with him, I think the term constitutive story stories allowed him to go beyond what he would have gone with national narratives or other terms that we have used in the past, or founding stories or founding myths. In Politics of Nation Building, I suggested that we use the term non-core group rather than the term national minority or kin group in order to discuss the targets of a state's nation-building policies, including assimilation, accommodation, or exclusion, as I lay them out in the book. There are several reasons, though, for this. I define non-core groups as groups perceived to be as unassimilated to the core group by the governing elites. In other words, going back to Rogers' work, they do not fit the criteria of inclusion based on the particular constitutive story of the time, and that, of course, can change. To begin with, not all recognized minorities, I was thinking at the time, are considered as non-core groups by the ruling elites of a state, especially in countries with so-called civic understandings of nationhood, legally recognizing minorities, right, as equal members of a nation. Sometimes they are, and sometimes they're just in theory, but that's besides the theoretical point I'm making here. Governing elites, however, sometimes decide to not give minority rights or grant minority rights to certain non-core groups in a country. but they're still non-core groups in the sense that they don't fit the constitutive story. So this is especially the case when they intend to assimilate them. For example, we heard from MERAL about the Kurds. Turkey did not recognize the Kurdish minority per se, in quotation marks minority, I would put, legally recognized a minority for decades. But there is little doubt that Turkey's governing elites have been considering significant parts of the Kurds as a non-core group, the way I talk about them, right? So that type of distinction could not be made with the previous conflation, let's say. Just to illustrate this and how, the way that, the constitutive story term allowed me to kind of imagine this terminology and be bold enough to propose it. We see here that when we start using this term non-core group versus core group, we can start seeing minorities, first of all, as potentially being on both sides, right? Because the term minority does not necessarily say much about what Ernest Renan would talk about as the daily plebiscite of these people. Someone could be legally recognized as a minority, but perfectly fit the constitutive story or even understand themselves as the core group and be recognized as such by the core group elites. Or they could fall in the non-core group category, right? So this is something that became available and imaginable in my framework in similar ways that I think Roger's work made available and imaginable certain things that were not available before. I could go on with this, but I think everybody got the point of what I'm trying to say with the first example. So I see this conceptual move as a way to achieve similar things to what Rogers, I believe, achieved with the term constitutive stories. Now, beyond that, my view of accommodation was also influenced, what I call accommodation in the tripartite discussion of nation-building policies between assimilation, accommodation, and exclusion by Roger Smith. As he put it, civic ideals are not always so civic, right? He has said that a few times in his writings. And similarly, I could say accommodation in my framework, which refers to situations where differences of non-core groups are more or less respected, and institutions that regulate and perpetuate these differences are put in place. That doesn't mean that those are benevolent policies, meaning sometimes the state is trying to institutionalize specific elements or specific differences that they want to perpetuate. And from that perspective, echoing, accommodation is not always as benevolent as it sounds. So importantly, from a Roger Smith point of view, I would say, the fact that difference is accepted and perpetuated does not necessarily mean that the non-core group does not still face discrimination, both by state institutions and by individual members of the core group. And that's something he has often alluded to through his work on citizenship regimes. His emphasis on differentiated citizenships was an inspiration also for my work on diaspora management and diaspora management logics, and the volume I co-edited on micro-foundations of diaspora politics. There, I've been focusing on important variation in citizenship regimes, both in theory and in practice. His work focusing on variation in citizenship regimes encouraged me to look at subnational variation and sub-diaspora variation. So for example, countries like Israel or Japan extend their policies beyond their citizens living abroad to include communities that have never lived in their purported homeland for generations, while others like New Zealand do not. Beyond the variation that I just mentioned, and the variation in how states define their diaspora or the boundaries of belonging abroad, I would say, there is also variation in the application of policy by each country. So for instance, countries like Canada and Sweden have more uniform policies to engage their diasporas, while others like South Korea vary their diaspora policy on the basis of citizen skills or co-national skills or host country of origin and so forth. So that kind of work was also inspired by Roger's understanding that we should understand this differentiation of how the same regime, in quotation marks, same, has different impacts on different groups within a society. Moreover, he has written, no community is natural, but no community is uncontested either. So in the United States, for example, he has shown how national identity has long been thought as primarily civic or creedal, but in his groundbreaking work, he has emphasized that multiple competing traditions existed, including what he calls liberalism, republicanism, and ascriptive forms of Americanism. And this finding has been substantiated over and over again by other scholars since. Now, his emphasis on examining the content of different constitutive stories and linking them to different outcomes is at the heart of my work, for example, more recently with Maya Tudor, both in a piece we published in the American Review of Political Science, but also in a forthcoming book, where we investigate the several dimensions along which constitutive stories, to use directly his work here, vary and trace, and we're trying to trace their effects more systematically around the world. One of these dimensions is what we call popular fragmentation, for example, which refers to the degree that members of the nation cohere along a single national narrative. Again, as Rogers has put it, no community is natural, but no community is uncontested either. We took this as a charge to unearth such cases of contestation. So, for example, in this book, I write about early 20th century Greece, where popular fragmentation of nationness occurs between two sides of the so-called national schism at the time, between the Venizelists and the anti-Venizelists. The Venizelists were named after their leader, Eleftherios Venizelos, and the anti-Venizelists were kind of heterodetermined in this case. By the late 19th century, to be Greek, one had to be either born in Greece or to be of Greek ancestry, typically speak Greek and be an Orthodox Christian. Over 100 years ago, during the population exchange between Greece and Turkey, we find at least two understandings of what it means to be Greek, not just one. Venizelos' understanding of nationhood goes back to an address he gave early in the 20th century, in 1906, before he became Prime Minister of Greece, and he was living in Crete, where he argued, and I quote, "It is of great interest for Hellenism to propagate that its understanding of nationhood," I add of nationhood part here, "is so broad and so foreign to religious doctrines, so that within Hellenism can fit not only Christian believers, but also the believers in any other known and unknown religion." So very much parting way with this Christian Orthodox understanding of the late 19th century. Venizelos remained on message following World War I, when at the 1919 Paris Peace Conference, he stated, "Religion, race, language cannot be considered as reliable indications of nationality. The only unmistaken indicator is national consciousness, the purposeful desire of individuals to self-determine their lack and to decide which national family they desire to belong to." I end quote here. Finally, even after the Greek defeat in the Greco-Turkish war following World War I, Venizelos insisted that an important element of the foundations of a society is respect of all religious doctrines, even those that oppose all religious doctrines. So from the discussion above, it is clear that for Venizelos and his close associates, the population exchange was not a natural extension of their national ideology, but rather a pragmatic choice given the adverse circumstances. In the 1910s and up to the Greco-Turkish population exchange, we find at least two constitutive stories of what it means to be Greek, and they were in contestation with each other, both at the elite and the popular levels. Rogers' call to understand leaders as storytellers takes me to also my work with Nadav Selef on stateless nationalist movements. Why do stateless nationalist movements change their understandings of territorial claims they make? We looked at a number of hypotheses from the literature trying to explain both the timing, direction, and process of these type of changes of territorial claims. And based on our investigation, we came close to something that I think Rogers will find quite nicely dovetailing with his thinking. We found that shifts in the areas stateless nationalist movements seek are more often than not a byproduct of the politically competitive domestic environment in which these movements are embedded. As nationalist movements engage in the competition for mundane power and survival, their leaders may alter the rhetoric about the extent of the desired national state to meet immediate political challenges that are often only loosely related to territorial issues. If these initial tactical rhetorical modulations successfully resolve the short-term challenges that spurred their adoption, they can become institutionalized as comprising the new territorial scope of the desired homeland. So I think Rogers would agree, and by the look of his face, I think he does, that it is very much fitting with his framework. But this theme of the centrality of leaders as storytellers is also central in my forthcoming co-edited volume that was mentioned earlier by Jeff, Enemies Within. The invocation of fifth columns in the political arena, whether contrived or based on real fears, has recurred periodically throughout history and is experiencing an upsurge in our era of democratic erosion and geopolitical uncertainty. It was mentioned in the previous panel as well. The term scapegoating came up multiple times. Fifth column accusations can have baleful effects on governance and trust, and they call into question the loyalty and belonging of targeted populations. They can cause human rights abuses, political repression, and even ethnic cleansing. In Enemies Within, we systematically investigate the roots and implications of the politics of fifth columns. A key insight that echoes Rogers' work is that much of what we call in this volume fifth column politics involves attempts to redraw the boundaries of inclusion in society. As he has put it, leaders propose stories that resonate and make them central to the core group. I have spent most of my time trying to generate analogous terms, right, to constitutive stories in my own field of inquiry, to come up with conditions that may be accounting or structuring the content of such constitutive stories at different points in time, to come up with explanations about what resonates and what not, as he would put it, and finally, to trace the implications of the different constitutive stories on important political outcomes like inequality, patterns of political violence, and variation in nation-building policies. Rogers, thank you for the inspiration and for broadening our understanding. I think Roger Smith has managed to highlight the disjunction between how many of us think that constitutive stories, stories ought to be, and how they can be, given the human condition. I look forward to reading more on his answer to the question, who are we, or who can we be? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Harris. Okay, as we transition to Sarah's song, I'll just remind you that right after Sarah speaks, we'll have time for questions and comments from the audience, so please get those ready. And throughout, feel free, if the spirit moves you, to share reflections about Rogers in the chat. Okay, Sarah, thank you.
Thank you, Jeff, for introducing us and moderating. And it's a pleasure and an honor to participate in this conference honoring Rogers and to be on this particular panel with MERAL and Harris on the construction of national citizenships. I've known Rogers since 1998, so nearly a quarter century, when I started the PhD program in political science at Yale. And it's been wonderful to see some of my fellow grad students and faculty from that time during today's conference. I think I join the chorus of the many students who've had the privilege of working with Rogers in expressing enormous gratitude for his generosity and support and the seriousness with which he took our even half-baked ideas. So through Rogers's teaching and by the example of his scholarship, I've learned how to think about the role of ideas in politics. Material interests are key drivers of politics, but ideas shape how we understand our interests and how we conceive of our identities. As a political theorist, I've been especially interested in the elaboration of the ideas themselves, but I've learned from Rogers about the importance of studying ideas in historical context and understanding how ideas are marshaled to shape institutions and make policy. I want to focus my remarks on a few key ideas and approaches in my own work that have been influenced by and in conversation with Rogers's scholarship. The first is my tendency to adopt a middle ground or moderate approach to the problems that I have studied. In my first book, Justice, Gender, and the Politics of Multiculturalism, based on my dissertation supervised by Rogers, I examined tensions between granting accommodations for religious and cultural minorities on the one hand and promoting gender equality on the other. I argue in that book that it's possible to be a constructivist about identity and defend group differentiated rights in the name of equality. At the same time, I saw how group accommodations, such as granting exemptions to religious minorities from generally applicable laws and extending limited self-government rights to Indigenous communities, might conflict with promoting the equality of vulnerable minorities within minorities, such as immigrant women, women within religious communities, and women within Indigenous communities. In that book, I argued for a rights-respecting accommodationism that defends group-differentiated accommodations, but on the condition that gender equality is not seriously undermined. In his recent APSR article, Legal Civic Orders and Equitable Lived Citizenships, Rogers observes that religious groups in the US have long enjoyed exemptions and accommodations under federal, state, and local laws. The current Supreme Court is poised to move in a much more accommodationist direction, weakening the Establishment Clause if it permits football coach Kennedy to pray at the 50-yard line after public high school football games, if it allows religious families to use public funding to send their children to religious schools, and if it allows wedding vendors from bakers to wedding website developers to refuse to serve same-sex couples in the name of religious freedom. In my book, I had focused mainly on religious claims by minority religious groups, Mormons in the 19th century, Jehovah's Witnesses, Seventh-day Adventists, Jewish individuals. Whereas today, the claimants, at least the claimants we hear about in the news seeking accommodations, are more dominant Christian groups, Catholics, mainline and evangelical Protestants, although some frame their claims in terms of white vulnerability. In all these cases, the challenge is to determine where to draw the line between accommodating religion and protecting the rights of students not to be coerced into prayer, and the rights of LGBTQ persons to equitably access public accommodations. Rogers and I might disagree about where to draw the line in any particular case, but I believe that he has given us a helpful framework for mapping the complexities to guide our empirical and normative assessments. In my more recent book, Immigration and Democracy, I again argue for a middle way, this time to intervene in normative debates about immigration. On one side of the debate are proponents of open borders who regard borders as unjust and inefficient. Most migrants simply want to make better lives for themselves. If we accept that every human being is morally equal, there's no good moral argument for restricting the migration of people in search of better lives. On the other side of the debate are what some call closed borders proponents, but since very few people, even former President Trump, endorse entirely closed borders, it's more accurate to characterize the other side of the debate as those who favor absolute state sovereignty. Claims to absolute sovereignty over borders often stem from underlying concerns about identity and economics. Cultural nationalists focus on the impact of immigration on national identity. Economic nationalists are concerned with the economic impacts of immigration. When Bernie Sanders was running for president the second time, he was asked if he favored open borders, and he replied, "Open borders? That's a right-wing proposal, which says essentially there's no United States. It would be bad for American workers." The economist George Borjas contends that low-skilled immigration puts downward pressure on the wages of low-skilled native workers who must directly compete with immigrants in labor markets. And he argues for restricting low-skilled immigration in favor of high-skilled immigration. Like many nationalists, Borjas assumes the US has unilateral authority to make immigration policy, and that's a good thing. Where do I stand? I believe both open borders and absolute state sovereignty are flawed. Open borders proponents have not adequately considered the significance of citizenship and the importance of democratic self-determination. On the other side, defenders of absolute state sovereignty have not taken the claims of migrants seriously, and they fail to appreciate the multiple memberships and positionalities that people hold. I argue instead in the book for qualified state sovereignty, or if you want a slogan, controlled borders and open doors. I take this middle position on immigration because I believe it's normatively desirable and because it's politically feasible. Some might perceive any moderate position on contentious political issues like immigration as unpalatable, compromising values that should never be compromised. But I think a middle ground position can also be a principled way of acknowledging pluralism about values and political goals, as well as the necessity of forging compromise for the purposes of coalition building. So in my own thinking about citizenship and migration, I have been influenced by Rogers' scholarship on how political communities are created and maintained through the telling of stories of peoplehood. The morning panels gave a lot of attention to Rogers' work on multiple traditions and racial orders. I'm glad that today's panel, or right now this panel, can focus on narratives of peoplehood and citizenship. So one structural feature of the politics of people building that Rogers has identified is that senses of peoplehood are to a significant degree exclusionary. Most political leaders, of course, aspire to lead as many people and forge the broadest coalitions as possible, yet all coalitions involve exclusions. Because the established interests and identities of human beings are diverse and often conflicting, even the most ambitious leaders have to decide who their core constituents are. And I'm inclined to agree with Rogers's sobering claim that there is little prospect in the foreseeable future that any coalition will build support for a humanity-wide political community. But there are ways to counteract and temper the exclusionary features of the politics of people building. First, we can articulate more inclusionary stories of peoplehood at the national and state and local levels. I favor more civic stories that emphasize, for example, the ideals set forth in the Declaration of Independence and rights discourses centered on extending rights and real opportunities to exercise rights on the part of historically marginalized groups. But I have also learned from Rogers that it's naive to think we can rely on purely civic stories. This is also something that Harris touched on. All nations are also constituted partly by constitutive stories that seek to define elements intrinsic to their members' identities and senses of worth based on race, ethnicity, religion, gender, sexuality, etc. Such constitutive stories are useful to political leaders, especially when economic and political power stories are less available. While such stories can support valuable forms of political life, they also pose dangers that we have to acknowledge and counteract with more inclusionary stories. In my own work on immigration, I've tried to reconcile the exclusionary and the inclusionary aspects of the politics of peoplehood. On the one hand, I take seriously the value of collective self-determination of a people, which I argue grounds a qualified right to control and regulate immigration. At the same time, I have made justice arguments for extending membership to non-citizens who live in the territory of a state, including undocumented migrants, in virtue of the social ties they've developed, the contributions they've made, and their vulnerability to exploitation. I also recognize that the scope of our obligations extends beyond fellow citizens and non-citizens residing in our midst. And this brings me to a second idea in my work that's been influenced by Rogers, and that is the idea that our obligations transcend the boundaries of citizenship and that people can and do hold multiple senses of peoplehood. As Kathy Cohen remarked in the earlier panel, that we have multiple positionalities. In my book on migration, I argue for supranational obligations to protect and assist refugees. The normative grounds of these obligations are universal, humanitarian, and global justice obligations, but supranational obligations also have particularistic grounds. We citizens of wealthy countries such as the US have special obligations to assist refugees who have been subject to the coercive actions taken by our government. Thus, American citizens have special obligations toward the people that the US government's interventions in Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, to name just a few, have harmed and turned into refugees. War, of course, is not the only way of generating transborder obligations, and I've benefited from Rogers' articulation of his principle of coercively constituted identities. If I had to pick just one principle of Rogers's that I like the most, it would probably be that one. The nations and citizens have special obligations to persons insofar as those persons' identities, interests, and aspirations have been coercively constituted by past and present actions of the nations and citizens' governments. The implication is that such governments may be required to extend some forms of assistance, such as most favored nation, trade status, some form of confederation, or the option of partial or full citizenship to those who have been coercively constituted. I'm a big fan of this principle. It challenges the conventional dominant view of the world of absolutely sovereign states in which citizens hold single membership in a single state, and instead envisions a world of qualified sovereign states in which citizens hold multiple memberships, not only multiple national citizenships, but also strong senses of subnational and supranational forms of peoplehood. One challenge that I continue to grapple with is how to reconcile the different ideas that ground membership claims and that generate obligations. I think many of us would adopt Rogers' principle of coercively constituted identities and be persuaded by his application of this principle, showing the intertwined history of the US and the Southwestern states and to the people and government of Mexico. What follows for Rogers is that these considerations lead him to oppose, for example, the policy of attrition through enforcement endorsed by former presidential candidate Mitt Romney and other immigration restrictionists. Instead, Rogers favors preferences for Mexicans in US immigration policies. On the other hand, Rogers has also identified other potent bases of government obligations to citizens and non-citizens in American history, in particular, the idea of consent, active or tacit, which he discusses in his co-authored book with Peter Schuck. Many proponents of consent-based views of citizenship would oppose special preferences for Mexicans in US immigration policy. So how do we reconcile these different normative principles that push in opposing directions? I think part of the answer lies in a third key idea that I have taken from Rogers, and that is the importance of democratic contestation. In discussing the principle of coercively constituted identities and its implications for US immigration and citizenship policy, Rogers says, quote, "The broader case for a democratic politics of multiple intertwined peoples suggests it's appropriate for states and localities to seek to push national policies in more anti- and more pro-immigrant directions through bottom-up means. As divisive as recent American experience has been," and he was writing that before the Trump presidency, "the contentious politics of peoplehood involving different state, national, and ethnic communities with varying senses of identity retains real prospects for finding acceptable accommodations of their conflicting aspirations and obligations, and so remains worth pursuing. I detect hope that a contentious democratic politics of peoplehood will produce acceptable accommodations. Of course, it's not a sure thing, more like 2 steps forward, 1 step back, an unsteady march that depends on human agency to build broader coalitions and mobilize for more inclusive policies. Rogers has shown how modern America's growing embrace of multiple overlapping identities in a rapidly diversifying society is in tension with the providentialism, exceptionalism, racism, and patriarchy that continue to hold sway over many Americans. A big challenge for our time is how, in Rogers's words, to create and sustain flexible forms of moderate peoplehood that renounce claims to unlimited sovereignty and strive to recognize and accommodate as many of the multiple memberships persons have as proves politically feasible. And that challenge falls on us, we the people of democratic societies who aspire to build a more inclusive union. I want to end by returning to the idea of stories. Rogers has shown that stories of peoplehood center on certain themes, and in co-authored work with MERAL, they take certain narrative forms. I wanted to reflect also on whether stories of peoplehood have a genre. Lately, I feel like we're living in a tragedy or perhaps a dark comedy. But as Rogers has suggested, perhaps the story of American peoplehood is better thought of as an adventure story with heroes and anti-heroes duking it out to leave their mark on history. We don't yet know how the story will end, but we know human agents can shape the narrative. To quote Rogers, quote, "At least some of the time, political actors have imagined and formulated effective stories that were in important respects novel. And if they had not done so, history would have gone very differently." Rogers, without your scholarship, your teaching, and your mentoring, our understanding of politics would have gone very differently, much for the worse. Thank you. Congratulations on your retirement. And in the next chapter of your life, I hope you'll have more time for personal adventures, but I also know you'll be at your desk writing more books and articles to help us make sense of the ever-evolving American stories of peoplehood, because we want more stories.
Thanks so much. Great. Well, we have a good amount of time for discussion, so please raise your hand. I guess I'll start things off. I personally find the work on peoplehood and stories of peoplehood one of the most exciting and compelling parts of Rogers' oeuvre. I agree that stories of peoplehood are important, that they're necessary, that they're what leaders should be focused on providing, but I don't hear it being claimed that they're necessarily true. That there's an inherently fictive aspect perhaps to the idea of stories. And so my question for the panelists who seem to share the broad sense of narratives being so important, what distinguishes stories of peoplehood from propaganda? How do we know the difference between those things? And perhaps you've already pointed to some of the answers. Harris and Sarah, you each suggested in different ways the significance of competitive, contestatory processes in a vibrant culture. And maybe that is part of the answer. But what do you say to someone who doesn't want to believe things that aren't true and stays out of nation building and processes of solidarity for that reason as well? Whatever angle you tackle it, I'm just curious about how do we draw the boundary between the good stories of peoplehood we want and the desire not to be subject to propaganda on the other side?
Maybe Rogers should answer.
Who said that? Is that Harris?
I said it, yeah.
Yes, well, we can let Roger speak as he chooses. I think he's, well.
I'm joking. I don't know if anyone.
Rogers, do you want to go? No? Yeah. I can add a couple of points, and please join me whenever you want. I kept thinking about this, there are a couple of things here, I think. One of them is fabrication versus truth. And I think stories a good story needs to be as truthful as possible. And there are stories that they are selective. I think every story is selective, but you might be selecting to the best of your knowledge to create a story that can be true. But what I wanted to specifically add here is that not always, like, true stories might not, and we talked about this earlier with Rogers, I still remember that not all true stories aren't also good stories, right? The lessons that you derive from them are going to be very important. And I think Harris will understand the collective traumas that countries have and on which they build, and what they tell might be very true. Trianon Treaty, the Versailles Treaty, the Sevres Treaty, the Turkocratia, the War of Kosovo for the Serbs, they might all be true, but it is mostly the lessons that we try to derive from such stories. If they're going to perpetuate cycles of violence, xenophobia, and parochial communities, I think even truth cannot save us. But I definitely see it. I mean, first of all, some politicians aren't just suited, or some people aren't suited to talk in terms of stories. They might see like they're talking down to people. So that's, I think, truly understandable. But they could at least counter the stories that are told. They could show the conflicts within those stories, the contradictions in those stories, which are plenty, of course. Keeping archives in this age, I think, is very important way of fighting with such stories as well. Because in Turkey, for example, recently some newspapers that were bought by pro-government business people have erased all their internet archives. So all of a sudden it's gone. So memory work and good memory work can also help perhaps counter some of those stories. But I think that's a very valid point, Jeff, you're right.
Can I add to this? I agree with the issues about the veracity, but I think given what MERAL said, a lot of work needs to be done to understand whether you're forced to abide by a story, even, true or not true, then it's the politics about belonging, right? So, and I think Roger's work also speaks to that, in the sense that, do we have an institutional framework where you can actually say, this may be a true story, but I don't want to be a part of it, right? Or are we in a Rousseauian world where you have to be forced to be free, right? Is there kind of like a general will that everybody needs to, and that's kind of like, Mussolini's Italy would be an example of organic nationalism, where the individual cannot exist outside of, the constitutive story. It only has meaning through the story. That, I think, is a different discussion. I think MERAL's points are completely, I second them in terms of the content, but then there is a second level discussion, regardless of the however you characterize the content. What are the coordinates within which you can have dissent or, positionality outside or inside of such a story, and a space for contestation to even happen?
I just wanted to quickly add that I think it's a fine line between propaganda and maybe a good story of peoplehood. And I think the good bad line doesn't necessarily coincide with true and false. So some true stories might be deemed to be bad, and some false stories might be hailed as very good for people building purposes. I've recently been teaching First Amendment law, and students are always puzzled over false and deceptive commercial advertising is outlawed, but false and deceptive political speech and advertising that's fair game, because we need breathing room for political debate and contestation. But I think that maybe one check that we can draw from Rogers's framework is that whether it's a story of economic worth, political power, or even ethically constitutive stories, that at the end of the day, people might be looking for results. And if the stories fail to deliver the promised goods or the promised glory, that might act as one check. So maybe there's some outer limit to which you can just keep feeding people lies.
Thanks for those responses. Let's now go to Ian Lustig. So wait for a second, Ian, to be unmuted by Matt, and then you can unmute yourself.
Thank you very much. This is a great event, and I'm pleased to be here. And this is a great question, Jeff. I'd like to introduce the difference between the truth of a story and whether it is hegemonic or not within the community to which it's directed. And there's a relationship between the two of them, because if it is hegemonic, and it had, or at least at what time was, that suggests that there was a kind of truth attached to it. And this comes up all the time in Jewish Passover Seders. Do you really believe this story is true, that the Israelites, built the pyramids and the Pharaoh's army was drowned in the sea? Do you really think it's true? Well, No, not in the sense of empirical truth of behaviorists, but it is truly capturing something that was a hegemonic belief in the Israelite community in the early millennium. And those values and those tropes, which were able to capture the imagination and hold it of a cultural group for hundreds and thousands of years, that is a truth. We can learn from that about that people. And so I urge people to think about not so much is a story true only, but did it achieve hegemony, and what can we learn from the fact that this story achieved hegemonic status in this culture?
Thank you. Elsbeth, nice to see you.
Nice to see you. Yeah, so just to go off Jeff's question about propaganda and Sarah's really, I think, wise answer saying that there's this fine line between the two, I immediately thought about how I've always approached Roger's work as speaking across his sort of different segments. So if we take multiple traditions from this morning and we take racial orders from this morning, I see those as speaking very much to stories of peoplehood and to indeed sometimes really bad forms of propaganda, but sometimes not so bad forms of propaganda. And so there's this sort of, I'd love to hear comments about kind of the struggle that we might see within stories of peoplehood that brings things like multiple traditions into that discourse. So.
Thank you, Elspeth. Let's hear from Mark Graber.
This may be the Dartmouth Hillel School of Peoplehood. Since first Ian and I meeting after, I think the last time we may have met may have been Passover at Dartmouth Hillel 45 years ago. But in fact, at our Passover service, we say the moral of the story is you shall not oppress the stranger among you. And one of the things that strikes me is, as someone on the left who identifies religiously, we have tons of progressive stories. And I'm wondering, and by the way, the religious left accepts public secularism, whether the decline of the religious left in the countries we've been talking about partly explains a decline in the capacity of progressives to tell stories, tell powerful stories, and appreciate their power, that in fact, those who retain a religious tradition have always understood.
Let me throw out another question to consider, please feel free to respond to Mark or the existing conversation, but you know, neoliberalism is a topic that is constantly being discussed today, and there's many efforts to understand just what it means. And I wonder if the angle of peoplehood provides some leverage to explore some of its meaning. In other words, I'm curious, would the panelists interpret neoliberalism as, in Roger's terms, stories that only focus on economic growth and economic concerns to the exclusion of constitutive themes and other political themes? Or does it go much more foundational than that? Is neoliberalism an attack on any sense of peoplehood, any sense that it's important to tell stories, and a kind of atomism or skepticism towards anything that isn't material measured? I'd just be curious how, if it is true we're living in a neoliberal moment, that moment is being translated at the narrative level.
Thank you both, Mark, Jeff, for the questions, Elspeth for the comments, and Ian also. I was going to first separate the normative from what we observe, right? I think it's one thing, for myself, for example, for politicians, I'm not very keen that they tell stories. Like, that's not something that I would expect, but my observation from the Turkish case particularly, and from other cases as well, is that those who don't have a story, or we could say the same thing for the American politics as well, those who don't have a story just cannot compete with those who have a story. That is an observation I think in the last mayoral elections in Turkey, for example, if you have been following any of them, Istanbul elections, against all odds, they had the rerun elections, they didn't count the elections. It was a typical example of even worse than competitive authoritarianism. But that mayor who's now elected, he was praised for the stories he's telling, whereas the leader of the main social democratic party, the left, is very well known for his like reason giving and details that he provides, numbers, etc. But it just doesn't have that appeal. So he could tell the same things, but he could perhaps tell them in a way that they're going to make more sense to the people. It can be, by the way, I think it can be a story. It doesn't have to be a cultural story, etc. It could be a story on social democracy, redistribution, fairness. An inclusive and pluralistic story, I think, is 100% possible in that regard. And to Jeff's question on neoliberalism, I think there's hypocrisy of neoliberalism, that I think it's the biggest storyteller and would want others to act as if it's not a story. Like in Polanyian sense, I think it is telling us. It is telling so many stories about the lazy, like welfare queen, and so many other actors are involved in the story that something that you would in another context, in a welfare state, for example, would see as a duty, a responsibility of the community to hold up, would just be seen either as white trash or as an undeserving citizen. And that's, I think, from the broader story that neoliberalism tells about market determinism. So it is telling a story, but it's telling it with numbers and statistics and like self-made politicians coming from humble beginnings. Even like, I think it has so many elements. So perhaps as social scientists, one of our duties is to debunk the storied element of it. So thank you so much for bringing it up.
Let's go to Peter Hall and then Sarah.
I'm unmuted. So it's a wonderful gathering. I'm so glad to be here for at least a little piece of it. And I've learned so much myself from Roger's work. But I'm provoked by Mark Graeber's comment about neoliberalism to observe that stories and national narratives, of course, are about a lot more than about inclusion and exclusion. Yes, they define who's in and who's out in many ways, but you know, they're also what sociologists think of as criteria of worth. And I think in that regard, neoliberalism, I mean, speaking very crudely, of course, but a lot of neoliberal stories were really reaffirming meritocracy, or myths of meritocracy would perhaps be a better way to put it, shifting people's views about why some people succeed and why others don't, and what the criteria of success really are. And so I think that one reason stories are so powerful, and I'm sure Rogers would agree, is that they're multidimensional in that kind of respect. And then finally, I can't resist saying on the issue of truth or falseness, and whether truth matters, surely the definition of a story is that it is to some extent untrue, in the same way that every model put forward by a political scientist is at some level an undue simplification of reality. And that some of the power of stories seems to me to reside in what you might call the way they condense reality. Some of the power lies in the ways in which they're false, as opposed to the ways in which they're true. But I must say I enjoyed the panel very much, and it's a really important set of questions, really thought-provoking questions.
If I can add something, Jeff, to what I said earlier in respect to the truth part that Peter Hall also brought up. I think a lot of, at least the empirical political science, would focus most on the resonance and the degree of resonance, or the variation in resonance, rather than the veracity, which could end up being almost like intertwined with a more moral or normative discussion, which I think is implied in some of the questions. And Rogers is grappling, I think we should ask Rogers at some point. I think he himself in the Stories of Peoplehood is constantly oscillating between the ought and the is. And sometimes he feels he needs to take a stance, but at the same time, it's an analytical book. So it's a, as I said in my talk, I think it's a disjunction that, and a perennial kind of problem that we're dealing with.
Thank you. Sarah, did you want to jump in?
Sure. I'm really enjoying this discussion and lots of terrific questions. And I just wanted to touch on a few things that various people said, but just going off what Harris just said in response to Peter Haw. I think that truth or falsity matters less than the impact the stories have on economic worth, our sense of trust, whether they offer persuasive senses of identity, et cetera. So maybe that's where our attention should be, and less whether it's really true or really false. And then just on Jeff, your question about neoliberalism, I agree with MERAL that we shouldn't be duped. Neoliberalism is also a story. They're telling a story about Homo economicus. So it's not just about the economic worth at the expense of everything else, but I think it's offering us a vision of what human beings are and what ideal relationships, including the market, look like. So I think it would fit as a kind of, on all those, it tells stories about economic worth, it instills senses of trust, it also says something about political power and who should have it, and also our senses of identity. And then on to Mark Graber's question about, the decline of the religious left to tell powerful stories. I think about the civil rights movement, and I know Reverend William Barber and others today are trying to pick up a kind of, a sense of the religious left and our responsibilities to address poverty and fight for economic and racial justice. But I think that for some reason, those religious stories are on the conservative side and being more persuasively told. And I'm sure Rogers has thoughts about this.
Let's hear from, thank you, Sarah. Let's hear from Nancy.
Hi. So I just want to remind everybody that, a lot of what I would consider really bad people believe a very powerful story that's around right now, that the election was stolen. Okay. And this seems to be a culmination of the story that has been building up, that was talked about in the previous panel about the disaffected, vulnerable, economically, white Americans, particularly white male Americans, who feel economically disempowered and excluded. And that this story has purchased, and people on the left are countering with a very venerable story about the history of democracy and how United States democracy works, and it has no purchase. It is not making progress. So I love that Rogers is such an optimist about American democracy. But, the cynic in me says, it's not working anymore. And I don't know what to do about that. And I just like to hear what some of the panelists have to say about the importance of stories in the face of people who have these really bad stories that they want to adhere to really strongly, and just aren't going to listen to the counter narratives. Sorry, but
Big question. Do any of the panelists want to attack that?
I think that's a tough one, but I'll bring the concept back that Ian mentioned, maybe in terms of hegemony. So maybe, and then that's an example that he actually, since I didn't get to talk at his retirement, I think I can say a couple of things here as well on Gramsci and the fact that you cannot make someone a soldier who is having just a little bit of food that he's doing fine. You can convince them about that, but you can't convince a starving soldier that they're doing okay. So yes, in the face of like with the vaccine and everything, I think even if you give the entire information, you'll still have people that will not believe you. But it's not so much, I think, about convincing everyone, but convincing enough people that it matters. And we have seen this happening. Like I agree, and sometimes I am like in that case with the Istanbul elections, for example, I was both shocked with the patience and the optimism of that opposition candidate. But his story, he actually managed to appeal to some of the core constituency of the Erdogan's AKP. So maybe we won't be able to convince everyone, but maybe convince enough people that it will make a difference, even in the lives of a couple of people, perhaps. But I see your point, and I agree, it's very tough. It's very hard to be optimistic in these days.
Can I add some optimism, maybe? So the only optimism I would bring up is, I mean, again, drawing from how Rogers talks about this in his work, is that, and I think some panelists in various panels mentioned this, is the role of agency, right? When you start seeing how Rogers talks about stories of peoplehood, there is a lot of agency, and he doesn't define who are the leaders, right? Anyone could become a leader, right? In theory, anyone could articulate a story as long as it resonates. Going back to Anne Lastik's point, it could be counter-hegemonic initially. It could become hegemonic at down the road, right? Saner Aktürk has written a book trying to see how such transformations happen in dominant constitutive stories. And at the same time, it's the hope comes from the fact that there is a lot of room for contingency in this, and there is a lot of room for contestation in this, right? It's not a structural, over-deterministic kind of story that he has told us. Now, again, the downside, of course, is whatever you said earlier, that there are some really dominant, resonant stories that, you know, are dangerous, but that doesn't preclude the fact that we have voice and we have ways to articulate counter narratives and counter stories. So I think that a lot of emphasis should be given on the counter arguments or the counter stories. And what would those be?
Let's go to Sarah and then Elsbeth.
Just really quickly in response to Nancy's question about many Americans believing the election was stolen, I think you're right to sense optimism or hope in Rogers's work, but I think there's a difference between progress toward greater inclusion and greater equality being inevitable. I don't think that he's a kind of meliorist that, oh, just have faith it's going to work out, but actually, and I remember after Trump was elected, returning to read some of Rogers's work, and he kind of advises us that there's no guarantee, even as we've been on this unsteady march, expanding the circle of rights and membership, that it's possible very much so to move in exclusionary directions. But I think that the passage I quoted in my talk from Rogers about finding acceptable accommodations through democratic contestation, I think it rests on some key assumptions that we used to take for granted and now that we can't, like a basic commitment to democratic institutions, that when you lose an election, you accept the loss and you return to fight another day, or that also the splintering of people on social media to where they get quality information, where they get their information. And so we no longer, I mean, I think contestation doesn't work if we're all siloed and people are only talking to people they agree with. And I think that, so there are aspects of how contestation is operating today that should make us more pessimistic, but I don't think that Rogers is naively optimistic. And I think that he has anticipated in his own work all the things that have happened in the last decade in American politics.
Well, we're almost at time, so let's turn to Elsbeth for the final comment or question.
So Sarah essentially got at my final question, which was when I was listening to this, I was thinking of institutions and I was thinking of the role of the media and, the filibuster and the Supreme Court right now. And when Nancy was talking about the sort of the big lie that Trump won the election, and that just keeps being perpetuated by Congress. And so there is this sort of tendency to talk about agency, even from an when we're talking about an institutionalist like Rogers, without getting at the institutions of the media and the vehicles in which people get and digest these stories. And so Sarah touched on that. I'd love to hear MERAL touch on that as well, and also Harris, if they have a second.
Great, thanks, Elsbeth. Why don't we use your question as a way to turn one last time to the panelists so they can address issues you just raised or anything else they want to say in conclusion. So MERAL, should you start us off?
Sure, Elspeth, thank you so much. You actually read my mind because I kept thinking, particularly under competitive authoritarian settings, if you don't even get media access, for example, how are you going to make your story heard equally? So that's a problem already in the American context in terms of conglomerate media, etc. Like how much is one side of the story going to be heard compared to the other side? It gets even worse in other asymmetrical environments. I mean, I'm sure you have the bravest, most peace-loving people in Russia who could tell you a very peaceful story about what's going on, but what's going to be the outlet where they're going to do it, and what's going to be the punishment of doing so. So including context, I think that's the beauty of Rogers's work as well. It's not just a theory that is like operating in a vacuum, but it is grounded context-wise, and it allows for so much variation in terms of observing this, and it makes it only harder, I think, to have those stories being heard in mock democracies where like you have a couple of people perhaps speaking in like very marginalized TV channels, if they can even talk at all, versus the other story being very dominant. That makes a lot of sense. Thank you.
Okay, Harris, and then Sarah.
Sarah, do you want to go first? Okay. So I wanted to thank the organizers. I don't have a better answer than Meral's on this front. And I want to emphasize the point about contingency and agency. I think that's the optimistic way, but again, that's constrained. And I think that's part of the reason why Rogers, invited some folks who are doing work on some of these constraints, I think, on this panel and try to understand these constraints and try to, I think he thinks like as a good empirical political theorist, he's thinking, I believe, that we first need to understand how the world is in order to get to the ought. And I see that as a very constant thread in his work. And that's not common in everyone's work, I have to say. That I think he's constantly conscious of that. And in a way, if he finds that our work, those of us who are not as good empirical political theorists, we're just more empirical political scientists. If he finds that useful for his work, I'm very happy about that, but I'll leave it at that.
I just wanted to say thank you to Rogers and to my fellow panelists for this terrific discussion. And just end by my own portion by just saying, Rogers, we look forward to more writing now that you're going to be officially retired.
Thanks, Sarah. Okay, that wraps up our third panel. Thank you all for a really nice discussion. And the final panel will start at 3:30. It will be on the topic of competing visions of the construction of desirable political identities and the role of political science. So look forward to seeing many of you then, and take care in the meantime.